and welcome to the Eat Real to Heal podcast. I am your host, Nicolette Richer, and on today's episode of the Eat Real to Heal podcast, I am very excited to welcome Suzanne Methot to our show. Now, Suzanne is one of the participants in a 9-part series of interviews, individuals that agreed to share their wisdom with us, their knowledge and expertise and lived experiences to support my research in understanding what are the barriers that exist in BIPOC communities around North America. What are the barriers that are there that prevent them from accessing clean, real foods that are capable of reversing chronic diseases? And you will be so incredibly surprised by the responses if you have not delved into these topics ever before. So I encourage you to listen to the whole entire podcast series where I interview 9 participants as part of my dissertation by portfolio for my PhD.
We might see it as a barrier of poverty, but to me, it's a barrier of actually having food security and control over food within communities.
Yes.
Because right now the food is owned by these multinational corporations, and the seeds and the inputs, whether it's glyphosate, Roundup Ready, whether it's GMO seeds, whether it's the nitrogen fertilizers, which you don't need because organic farmers use composted poop.
Exactly.
Why do you need nitrogen? You know what I mean? Yeah. So I think the barrier is that now food is no longer being produced in most or many communities, especially Indigenous communities. And
Now, Suzanne Methot is the author of the award-winning nonfiction book called Legacy: Trauma, Story, and Indigenous Healing. She is the co-author of the grade 11 textbook, Aboriginal Beliefs, Values, and Aspirations, and she's a contributor to Scholastic's Take Action series of elementary classroom resource books. Her new YA book, Killing the Wittigo, Indigenous Culture-Based Approaches to Waking Up, Taking Action, and Doing the Work of Healing, will be published in June 2023. And I cannot wait to read that book, because Legacy is a moving, inspiring, incredibly telling story of the history of colonization and as it relates to our Indigenous healing, as it relates to the trauma that prevents that healing from happening, and also solutions for moving forward. So you will be moved by that book, Legacy. I encourage everybody to get a copy for yourself. Now, Suzanne has over 30 years of experience creating and applying equity and anti-oppression frameworks, building an adult literacy and skills training practitioner, and then as an elementary classroom teacher specializing in social justice education. And of course, during this time, she worked in advocacy and direct service positions at Indigenous-led organizations, including the Native Women's Resource Center of Toronto and the Anishinaabe Nation Health and Environment Program, the YWCA Elm Center and West Neighborhood House, serving community members healing from intergenerational trauma and reclaiming culture while marginalized by racism, poverty, homelessness, health status, addictions, mental health challenges, crime, and victimization. Suzanne has an incredibly huge heart. She is a brilliant human being. She is wise inside, outside. She is connected to everything around us. It is important that we learn from the lived experience, the research, the expertise of Suzanne, and we share this information with others. So please go ahead and share this podcast with others that you feel would love to learn about this or need to learn about this. And then collectively, if we can all start sharing this information, we can collectively start working towards finding solutions so that the healing may begin for all. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to the previous 3 episodes of this 9-part series. and enjoy. Hey, hi, everyone, and welcome to the Eat Real to Heal podcast. This show is part of my research that I'm doing to complete my PhD. We're coming up to the end of the research, and today we have the wonderful Suzanne Methot, the author, brilliant woman of legacy. So we're going to be diving in here to really look beyond all of the risk factors that our current government and current researchers and scientists is saying is the cause of the disproportionate rates of diabetes out there. So, most agencies are saying it is because of obesity, alcoholism, it's because of bad lifestyle choices. And Suzanne, more than anyone, because of all the extensive research that you've done, Suzanne, you know that that's not the case. So welcome to this interview and welcome to our Eat Real to Heal podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to share this time with you.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. So our listeners, a lot of the information you are going to be sharing is information that our listeners are going to be hearing for the very, very, very first time ever, because we've been raised in a colonized world. We have not been taught the history of colonization at all, really, throughout school, and it's been one-sided. And now, though, a lot of research is coming out, including your research, which is truly showing what the root causes of these disproportionate rates of chronic disease are. So as I pose that question or statement to you, I'm going to leave it to you to kick off with whatever comes to your heart and mind that you want to share with our audience.
Oh, wow. How much time do we have?
We can have multiple interviews because we have lots of time.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much that is part of it, but what is coming to my head and heart first is this whole idea of colonization, meaning, and for me, I define colonization as, mostly historic events happening in the past, right? The events of colonization, the so-called New World and the making of Canada and the US and even Mexico and, all the countries of the Americas. And then I define colonialism, which is like a way of thinking, right? So colonialism is still with us today. And colonization is still with us today, too. I mean, the government is still actively pursuing policies and procedures and, a form of, I wouldn't say relationship, because it's not a true relationship, but a form of interacting with, when I speak from an Indigenous perspective, with Indigenous peoples, that is very colonial in nature. So the first thing that comes to me is the effects of colonization and colonialism. And for me, that's about control. And I'm using here the work of Judith Lewis Herman, who wrote a book called Trauma and Healing back in the 90s. And it's a classic, still available. And Judith Lewis Herman researched, her original research was around domestic violence and the experiences of women who had been under the control of their, partners, and how that looked for them in terms of when they left those relationships. The effects that having gone through that for years and years and years, decades in some cases, depending on their histories, how that affected the way they interacted with the world, interacted with their children, interacted with other people, how they thought of themselves in terms of identity and agency. And she documented that it was like a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, but it wasn't PTSD from like a one-time experience, like in war or an accident or an assault, a one-time experience. And so she called it complex PTSD, where it's all about control, right? And so for me, I use complex post-traumatic stress disorder as sort of my large I want to say overlaying, if that's the right word, framework to describe the forces of colonization and colonialism, because it's all about the colonial government controlling Indigenous lands, Indigenous peoples. And when I say peoples, that means, yes, the everyday, you know, departmental people saying, well, no, you can't have your glasses or other medical procedure today because we say no. Or I shouldn't laugh, but it's kind of ridiculous when you consider it, right?
Yeah.
And so there's that everyday sort of control. And then there's all these larger forms of control, right? Which is like control, as I said, of Indigenous lands, whether it's treaty lands, by the way, or unceded territory. And about half of Canada is unceded. That's and Some people don't aren't familiar with that word, and I've heard it spell. I've heard it spelled. No, I haven't. I've seen it spelled unseated, like
Right.
Seated. Close, but not quite. Unseated is Unceded. So not ceded through war or treaty making, not, you know, given away, given over, sold,
Yeah.
exchanged, nothing like that. About half of Canada is still unceded. And then there are treaty lands. But in both cases, you know, the colonial government has assumed control. You know, and so this has resulted in all of these effects, both, you know, that you can see starting 100, 150 years ago when, you know, Canada was starting as a country, and continuing today. And I think what I'd like to end with saying is that, you know, when you experience control, and so I use the term, there's a control figure, whether it's a colonial government, whether it's an abuser, whether it's, you know, whatever the context is. You know, it could be like a white system or institution that's sort of authority figures over you, you know, whoever, whatever it is. That loss of control over your daily life, your way of thinking, your ability to be in the world, um, your very identity, all of these things, your ability, oh, and this is a big thing, and I don't think I've mentioned this yet, I should add, also your voice. There's a lot of voicelessness, I find, and I should say, you know, that I experienced myself growing up in a small northern Alberta town, with my particular identity, and just being silenced all the time, being told, we don't want to hear from you. What you say has no, you have nothing to contribute to this conversation. And also finding it hard to speak up to authority figures because I was told early and often that I was lesser, that I was inferior. And then, of course, because of my parents' experiences in their lifetimes, when they became parents, they had heard those messages themselves. And so they replayed that in the family home, even though they did try to create a family and to create joy for themselves. I mean, isn't that what all people want? I mean, of course. And they tried, but they were, I don't want to use the word damaged. At the same time, I don't find it as bad a word as some people think it is, because I think, you know, we're all damaged in some ways, but damage is never, it's something you can change. Anyway, their experiences definitely had an effect on their parenting. And so there's a sense of voicelessness that you have as someone who has experienced, you know, any kind of being told that you are not worthy, you are not enough. And that's what Indigenous peoples have been experiencing for decades, centuries now. It depends on, you know, the area of the Americas, the time of contact, the specific relationships, et cetera, et cetera. So when I look at all of the health issues today in Indigenous peoples, in my own family, and certainly in my own life, I see a lot of that as being so connected to that sense of just, I'm not here, I'm not worthy, and feeling, the big fancy word is depersonalization. Like,
Mm.
looking in the mirror and not even recognizing yourself as yourself. And when I talk about that, it's sort of like, it's hard to understand if you've never experienced it, maybe. It's sort of like when, and I'm glad that this term is being, more accepted nowadays after the COVID pandemic. Um, the idea of brain fog 15 or 20 years ago,
Yeah.
nobody knew what that really meant. But then, if you've experienced it, as I have for literally decades of my life, once you stop it by getting your health back into balance, then when you're out of it, you look around the room and you go, where was
Yeah.
I? And why was I not here? What just happened? Because all of a sudden you're awake. And then
Yeah.
you only realize what brain fog is,
When you're
or
awake.
when you wake up from it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that sense of not having control. Your life
Mhm.
is just your life, and you're trying to live it. And then once you start making changes, whether it's health, spiritual, change, and for me that was through healing circles and ceremony and reclaiming culture, reclaiming family narratives that had been hidden. um, Once you start doing that, then you start to realize, oh, that other place that I was at, wow. And you start to realize the difference. And
Mhm.
I think I'm sort of rambling a bit, sorry, but what I'm trying to get at here is that colonial governments are just, they have issues about control. They want to
Mhm.
control the narrative with the media. They want to control the narrative with the groups that they're dealing with. And they certainly want to control Indigenous lands and lives.
Yeah.
They have big issues with control. And so I once, when I was talking to a medicine person, I was really lucky. I'm living in BC now, but I spent many decades, 29 years in Toronto, working in the urban communities there, and well, some unreserved communities in Ontario as well, depending where I was working at the time. And I was lucky enough to have access to Anishinaabe Health Toronto. It was an urban Indigenous health center, and the medicine people that were coming down there in the 90s, usually from Manitoulin Island and some other places, one of them said to me that, all this diabetes, because I was having issues, and so I was asking about, could this be pre-diabetes? And
Mhm.
so this person shared with me, he said, it's really about being unable to be happy in one's life. It's like a metaphor, he said, about, we can't handle sugars because it's like our pancreases, they don't know how to handle the sweetness of life. And I
Mm.
remember hearing that, and it's always stuck with me for like 25 years now around it's really about not being able to handle the sweetness of life.
Mm.
That is so, it's horrific and poetic, and
Yeah.
and very much about examining the stories that we all carry and
Yeah.
how those are mediated by colonial forces who literally want to control us and our narratives.
Yeah.
And then understanding, okay, how does that play out in our lives, and how does that affect our health? And so high rates of diabetes and diabetes is an autoimmune disorder.
Yeah.
So all of the other autoimmune disorders, and I talk in Legacy around how our cancer diagnosis rates are going up and up. It was once unheard of in Indigenous communities, very rare. Now those are going up. Dementia and Alzheimer's is going up. All of these things that we did not experience prior to colonization. Um, a couple decades ago, there was some research going on that really wanted to, and it was very European race-based, weird idea about how we were actually responsible for high rates of diabetes because of some like gene. Do you remember hearing that?
The thrifty, yeah, the
Yeah,
thrifty
the
gene.
thrifty gene.
Yeah.
And now we have too much food. And so, like, what? Where do we have too much food? I mean, the rates of poverty in Indigenous communities, what? It was so weird. But it was our genes that were making us diabetic. And it's like, whoa, what is that? But again, that's the colonial government trying to control our narrative, right? So, did I answer the original question? It's
Well,
all about, for me, the control. Yeah.
Well, what I love about doing narrative inquiry is that you get to just go with it, flow. Like you just, but in that, it's like I'll just pull out some of the things that I was taking notes on. First of all, out of all the interviews we've done, nobody has framed it under the context of control, which I love this because it makes me automatically think, and I'm sure every listener here can relate to this, that it doesn't matter what race or religion you are, but as a child, when you have a parent that's trying to control you, what do? You rebel, you get depressed, you get angry, you want to fight back, or you just are like, you just are submissive, and and you lose that sense of agency. And then how do you behave? How does that child behave when they go to school? So if they have a parent controlling them, often they're wanting to control others at school because they need to have that sense of agency. So you just see this unhealthy spiral that comes from that, like the parents trying to like get the kid to eat healthy food, but if they're doing it in a controlling way, the kid's going to be like, nah, I don't want it, because you can take the child to the healthy food, but you can't force it to eat, right? And so it brings up a lot there. There's another piece just in everything that you said. Nobody's termed it in the sense of voicelessness, and so, and again, what happens to me in these interviews is, because I've always been approaching it like, okay, if we just eat the right food, we can reverse the disease. And it is true. I can take somebody, get them to eat the right food, their numbers get better, their diabetes goes away, their depression lifts. But if they haven't, like you said, reunited with their family histories, their own stories, they're still going to have, they won't have that sense of agency. It's just another form of control in a way, versus if that person connects with their ancestors and their ancestral foods, and they feel connected to those foods. I don't need to tell them to eat it, they'll just want to eat it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
So this is huge.
There's been a couple of media stories, and I know people who have done this personally, who have like gone back to what some Indigenous people call bush food, right? Because they felt that like the diets that were being given to them by the Western educated, even if they might have been Indigenous peoples, but Western educated, like dietitians, were like so restrictive. And as you say, it is in a way another form of control, just like schooling can be for Indigenous peoples. It doesn't mean that we don't want to learn. It means that it feels like a form of control. So thank you for hearing that. Yes. And but yet, as you say, when you go back to just thinking about, well, what foods were here before colonization? What foods are no longer serving me? What is my body saying no to? And what does my body, and that I don't want to open up too much here, but because it might not be the focus of your research, but I just want to mention briefly that that can also be related to dissociation as well. That if you're not in your body because of traumatic experiences, if you went over here, floating above, to try to, distance yourself from whatever experience you were having at the time, then coming back to ancestral foods, and as you say, those narratives, and how did my people, or my community, or my family, however you understand it, or how can I, could be a purely personal thing, take the knowledge that we once had, that we still have, that we saved, and use those foods to sort of create health. It brings you into your body.
Yes.
That's certainly been my experience, where now I'm not afraid to be here anymore, because I understand that, oh, quinoa is yummy.
Yes.
And if I put some reduced kale in there, a little olive oil, and some caramelized onions, I'm just saying, it is totally yummy. And,
Yeah.
indigenous to the Americas, I mean, I get my quinoa from a fair trade co-op down in, is it Ecuador or Peru? Can't remember exactly. I'd have to go look at the package. But, and it actually for me has brought me into my body. So you're exactly right on that.
Well,
Yeah.
and I had that, you were speaking about not recognizing yourself. And that was something that hit home for me because and all my friends that have known me for many years have known that up until a certain point, I had always been saying like, where's home? I don't know where home is because moved from Africa to Canada. Everything was brand new, but I was young at the time. But even still, I never felt home until I went back to Africa and I saw the way people lived and I saw the way my grandmother and all the villagers lived. And I saw the foods that they were eating. And these are the same foods I was trying to teach people here in Canada to eat. And then all of a sudden it clicked. And for the first time ever, I felt like I was home. So when I returned back to Canada after that trip, like you say, like eating these foods was not something I should do. It was just something my whole being embraced because the whole story came together. And I know for a lot in the work that we've done with Indigenous communities in the Squamish Nation, that in sharing stories about food as medicine, like I'm not here to teach it, like it's just a remembering process. But it's interesting because until that person has that experience of coming home to themselves and knowing their history. So when I would teach about potatoes, I said, we eat lots of potatoes on this therapy to reverse disease. And they'd be like, no, you can't eat potatoes, high on the glycemic index. But then when I would share the stories about the once a year harvesting of all the potatoes that naturally grow in the wild, and they'd be like, we did that? I'm like, you did do that, and then they'd be like, we can eat potatoes again,
Yeah.
but without the fear of eating potatoes, that control
Yeah.
that's been put on people through the dietitians and nutritionists who say you should eat this and shouldn't eat that.
Yeah.
So that's also
And
what was beautiful in what you said.
well, I'm sorry. Now I have to chime in about potatoes there, Nicolette,
Yes.
because I grow blue potatoes. They're not easy to find. There's a few, now that I'm here in BC, Gulf Islands area, I've located a guy in like Pemberton Valley. Sometimes we get them on what we call the Big Island, Vancouver Island. There's a couple people, and they're actually carried in the larger chain stores. Not shop at them all that often, but sometimes you got to, for certain items, and blue potatoes is one of them. But so I've started growing my own blue potatoes, and it's this idea of also monoculture, right?
Mhm.
Because the dominant society grows like only, I mean, somebody will have to Google this. I think it's like two, three, or maybe it's 20. I don't know, but only a few, maybe it's five, it's not up to 20, a few types of potato.
Yeah.
And this is what we all eat worldwide because they're exported, they're shipped. Of course, they've been, seed potatoes were taken over to Russia and to Ireland and all these places that didn't have the potato because potatoes were, my friends in Chiapas are going to not like this about me. Why do I always forget? It's not Mayan. Potatoes are Incan, right?
I
I
think
think.
Incan.
Was it
I
the
think
Incan?
Incan. Yep.
Yes, I should know that. Um, but here in the Americas, we, in the larger sense, indigenous peoples in the Americas, grew like hundreds of varieties of potatoes. And
Hmm.
all of them had their very specific medicinal and health and like energetic properties in
Hmm.
terms of when and why you would eat this. And see, I'm allergic to nightshades. I had a medical doctor, an MD, do all the skin tests. We did the big, elimination diet and the reintroduction. And then I switched over to an ND, a naturopathic doctor, for a lot of that other work after that. But, the guy just gave me, EpiPens and said, don't eat potatoes. And I'm like, what do you mean don't eat potatoes? I can't live without potatoes. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
glad I can still eat sweet potatoes, but like what? And then, I went through the list that MD had given me. Now he was an Eastern European guy, And so being Slavic background and coming from Europe before, and then starting his practice in Canada, it was clear that he had his own knowledge of farming
Mm,
practices where he was from, because I had no idea that blue potatoes even existed until I saw it on his list. So
right.
here's this white guy who's an allopathic, MD, telling me, well, don't eat potatoes. And then I'm like, well, what do you mean by don't eat potatoes? But he meant
Yeah.
like the white potatoes because he had
Yeah.
blue potatoes on his list,
Right.
right? And then I was like, what the heck are blue potatoes?
Yeah.
And I'd never heard of this. But anyway, not to make this into too much than it needs to be, but I mean, blue potatoes, and some people call them purple potatoes.
Yeah.
I call them blues, but um, that color is an antioxidant. And
Hmm.
so anybody, well, I shouldn't say this. I don't want anybody to have an anaphylactic reaction, but certainly for me, and my MD judged it to be, okay for me. Nightshade was one of my biggest things that I became allergic to through, decades and decades of having rampant body-wide inflammation, right?
Hmm.
But I can eat blue potatoes no problem, and I grow them because the blue color is literally medicine. That
Exactly.
that antioxidant, I don't know what it does, but in layperson's terms, it's like those antioxidants overpower the inflammatory response,
Yeah.
right? So even though I'm allergic, I can eat blue potatoes. So, and we had that knowledge,
Yeah.
but I didn't know about it. And that's because, again, of colonial control, government,
Yeah.
moving us off our lands,
Yeah.
taking away the knowledge, and also the trade systems that we had. Because maybe
Mhm.
not all of us would have grown blue potatoes, but we would have traded, as we traded for so many other items across
Exactly.
the Americas. Um, so yeah, it's very much about relearning. Yeah.
No, and you've made a lot of people happy right now because the number one thing all my clients say is, "What? I get to eat potatoes? I love potatoes. Who doesn't love potatoes?" But no, no, it's a very important topic, and bringing up that concept of diversity as well, which is and I call it a concept because diversity used to be prevalent all around us, and now it's the one thing that is dying off so quickly, and we have to now make it just part of our existence in our diet, in our
Yeah.
relationships, in our, in all aspects of our life.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, I want to go back to my original research question, which is evolving. Like at the end, it will probably not look anything like this. Um, so when I say ask this question: what are the barriers that BIPOC communities face in accessing the quality of foods that are capable of reversing lifestyle chronic diseases? Like, what are the barriers?
Hmm. Well, let me answer that in this way. I'll give you a two-part answer, and I'll
Hmm.
try to keep it concise. Um, if you had asked me that 25 years ago, I would have said, like, the surface symptom of colonialism, colonization, I would have
Hmm.
said poverty.
Hmm.
Because, being able to go to like the fancy stores with the fancy foods, we can't afford to do that, right? But now, and I think that's what we still hear sometimes today,
Yeah.
and even from within BIPOC communities. And I will illustrate this with a very short story. I was
Good.
working at an agency in 2014, and I wanted to do, how much background do you need? Like, I
Lots.
saw, well, there you go. I saw some of the women were like interested in new foods in the place where I was working. And sometimes they would see me eat my lunch. I'd go into the big, community gathering space where the empty tables were, and they'd be walking through, or they'd be talking over there, and they'd go, "What are you eating?" And I'd say, "Oh, that's grated beet salad, raw beets, carrots, some apple. What else do I put in here? Lemon and olive oil, and it's
Mm.
yummy." And sorry, my lips are all red right now from the beet juice. And they'd laugh like, that's weird food, Suzanne. And I go, yep, but it sure is tasty, right? So through those conversations, I found out that they were interested in these foods. And like, I've never tasted a beet. I'm like, you've never tasted a beet?
Yeah.
But then I'm like, well, neither had I until my 20s, really.
Right.
Um, so, you know, I wanted to do, and I did do like a little sort of, do I call it an event? It wasn't really a workshop. It was just getting together with the women, and we did 2 recipes. We did like a fruit crisp, and we did one with cane sugar. Well, actually, it was brown sugar, the usual topping that you use with rolled oats and brown sugar and butter. And we did one with coconut butter and quinoa flakes instead of the oats. And there was no sugar on the topping, but in the fruit, we used maple syrup. And when I brought this to the staff team, there was a woman of color who like rolled her eyes at me, and she was a good colleague. I don't want you to think that, this was the only way she ever was. We were
Yes.
very good colleagues, but at that moment, she rolled her eyes and she's like, "Oh, Suzanne, that food is so expensive. It's like, so I don't want people to think that, they have to buy things that they can't afford." And she had all of these things. And so by then I had changed. So that original answer about what the barrier is, me, I think we still hear this a lot, and a lot of us believe that, well, we can't afford good food because we may have class, been assigned to a specific class, or we're under or unemployed, or, generational poverty, or whatever it is. But I think the real issue, and as I told her, I said, actually, the ingredients, like I built this into, I guess it's a workshop, I'll call it that. I built this into the workshop, so let me allay your fears around the costs of these items. And the reasons why the costs are lower is because I shop at a member-owned food co-op. And all of the things I'm buying, or most of them, are sold in bulk. So we get good prices from the suppliers. And then also, because it's a member-owned co-op, our markup is lower than in the conventional stores, where someone claims that they own the food and then you have to buy the food from them. We are a member-owned co-op, and we're dealing directly with farmers, growers, suppliers, right? And I said, no, I don't worry. You can come to the workshop if you want. If it makes you feel better. I would never put that on the women that we're working with, because I know that a lot of them are, unable to work, or are in school and balancing like 3 different part-time jobs. I said I wouldn't do that for them, to them. And I think we kind of need to get that out of our head. So my answer today to you would be that, in fact, we might see it as a barrier of poverty, but to me, it's a barrier of actually having food security and control over food within communities.
Yes.
Because right now, the food is owned by these multinational corporations, and the seeds and the inputs, whether it's glyphosate, Roundup Ready, whether it's GMO seeds, whether it's the nitrogen fertilizers, which you don't need because organic farmers use composted poop.
Exactly.
Why do you need nitrogen? Like, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the barrier is that now food is no longer being produced in most or many communities, especially Indigenous communities. And if anybody's familiar with, CBC News, I mean, I know this is going worldwide, but some of the Canadian media outlets who routinely do stories on Indigenous communities who are, doing that work. Like they might have a bison reintroduction program, or let's say they're restoring the clam beds on a particular coast, Pacific Northwest, or they've started a community garden, planting potatoes and beets and carrots, and making food boxes, or greenhouses in Nunavut or Yukon, where they're growing a few things year round. And then using, solar for the heat instead of, using things that might be a little more contributing to greenhouse gases. So my answer today, I think, is the other C word that I dislike just as much as colonization and colonialism: capitalism. Yay!
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I guess what I want to end with there is this idea, and it's sort of like the diabetes question. And it's all, and it also happens with climate change. We talk about that today. It's downloaded onto individuals. Like, oh, Earth Day, turn out your lights. What? That has nothing to do with climate change.
Yeah.
I think CNN, they had a stat recently. I'm probably going to get it wrong, but I'm sure you can Google this and then correct me. It's like 70%, pretty sure that's correct, of all greenhouse gases are created by, I'm going to say, the top 100, I think that's correct, multinational corporations.
Yes.
But they want to download it on the individual, right?
Yes.
And so that's the same with food availability.
Yeah.
They want to say it's because of poverty, like we can't afford to, because so then, and then that's the colonial pull up your bootstraps, get to work, then you can afford the real food like everybody else. What? Time out, stop with that kind of thinking.
Yeah.
That is not what's happening here. We were pushed off the lands where we knew the wild foods were, where we did have mountain and prairie gardens. Yes, we did. A lot of people think that prairie peoples were these nomadic, going where the whatever was, like we didn't have agency, like we didn't think, oh, we could take that plant and grow it here. Like, duh. Of course we knew that, right? We ate inulin containing foods, like sunchokes in the mountains, right? We ate wild onion. We had wild ginger. These things are so healthy when they're added to a nice bison stew, We didn't just eat meat and pemmican, as good as pemmican is. Berries, fat, and meat, very balanced. But so yeah, I would have said poverty, but now I'd like us to start thinking differently and start thinking about how the systems and institutions, they lock up all the food, and then the homeless and underhoused people, who were, and I'm thinking of my local closest kind of town, 20-minute ferry ride away. I try to always shop at the health food store, the independently owned store here on my small island, but sometimes I have to go to the big island. And there's a lot of Indigenous folks who, sit on, the stairs outside of the mall where the big grocery store is, or they're at the bus stop, or and the food is all like locked up in the building. And it's like, that's the problem. It's not that we can't afford the food, or that we can't afford good food. Yeah, it's that we've been disenfranchised. Again, that's the agency. And pushed off lands and out of communities, and families, as much as we've saved, have also been fractured and taken away from that knowledge, and that ability to have control over what we put into our bodies. So.
Yeah, and this is definitely in my research. I saw this came up a lot for sure. There are a lot more articles published, a lot more speakers talking about this, being disenfranchised from the land, and which means that you lose the knowledge, right? So, and that's a huge part, because even as you talk about knowledge, like we can give vegetables to someone and they're going to deep fry them, and or turn them into whatever, like even like with the whole vegan movement, it's like, okay, let's take cauliflower and deep fry it and turn it in, like that, is that the healthy way? But when you talk about disenfranchisement from the land, and I love that you did end with that, it's that being taken away from the knowledge too, because the knowledge of how to prepare foods in a healthy way, the knowledge of how to use certain plant roots and different herbs and in combination to treat like diseases too, like also. So talking about the wild ginger, the wild onions, and inulin containing foods, growing gardens, these beautiful gardenscapes. So that is important. How to use compost, all of those things. It's not just being taken off the land; it's being taken away from the knowledge, which is very important. One thing that I just love is it was as you were speaking and telling these stories, it landed for me, often when you're doing PhD research, or research, a lot of people come up with theories and then they come up with graphs and designs and, that became the picture of the next book. But this is exactly what just showed up. And it's, we have a Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
And, but I see this as this, I don't know what the image will be. I see a pyramid, but seeing the superficial thinking, right, around what are the barriers that prevent Indigenous peoples, BIPOC peoples from being healthy. And, so yeah, we can talk about obesity, we can talk about alcoholism, but then we drop it down a notch. And then we can go deeper and we can talk about, like you said, 25 years ago, you would have said, and so yes, a lot of people are trying to treat the chronic disease epidemic that we're in, by just addressing poverty. So then you go into poverty, but then if you drop it down a notch from there, it's disenfranchisement from the land, and you drop it down a notch from there, and it's trauma, and it's to see it as being so multifaceted. But what, how far down this pyramid, up this pyramid do we go till we eventually get to what is that true systemic reason behind these epidemic rates of chronic disease that are upon us. Let's talk about the knowledge a little bit more here, because I think that's an area that even if we did have access to food, that, like, let's say, we were able to return back to moving across the territories and following the bison and, growing the gardens, and everybody has access to the food. Um, is that wisdom really, like, is it lost? Because a lot of elders now have been born into the world where colonization is like that. They've been taught to not eat potatoes. They've been taught to deep fried food. They've been taught, is it lost forever? Can we get it back?
The answer I give you today is probably going to be different 5 years from now or 20 years from now.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm 54, and when I was doing agency work in the 90s, so I was, what, in my 20s? What's my math? Yeah, I was in my 20s. How old am I? What year is it? I don't know. It's all a blur.
It's today. It's today.
There you go. Continuous ceremonial time. There
Yes,
we
exactly.
go. Thank you for asking that question, because it, as you just said, is another multifaceted thing. And it's different. You're going to get a different answer from any Indigenous person. Of course, BIPOC people will have different answers from within their various communities and perspectives. And we don't always have to agree, but and that's the beauty and the richness of conversation and learning and lifelong learning and collaboration, discussion. But what I would say is I'm going into my memory bank. I'm feeling reflective now, because I want to pay tribute. And so that's kind of answering your question, and then I'll move on from there. I want to pay tribute to the people who did save what they could save, because those were the people who taught me. I mean, growing up in northern Alberta, it wasn't cool to be Indigenous, and especially if you were from a mixed family, from like me, you tried to hide it whenever possible.
Yeah.
I mean, unlucky for me, I think, or perhaps lucky for me, I would say it was kind of both. I couldn't hide too much. It's just the way I popped out. I've got a half sibling with blue eyes and very light hair, never gets mistaken as Indigenous at all. Says they're white. Okay, we're mixed. You can be white if you want. But I was never white. I was never seen as white. I was always seen as Indigenous, or at least as, they used to say Métis, but that's incorrect, of course. Métis is a specific community. My word is mixed. So, I knew nothing. right? I knew nothing about nothing. I didn't even know. I'd be going through the family albums and saying to my mother, who are these people? Because they're Indians. Like, whoa. Why do we only talk about being Scottish, Mom? Right? And I wrote a little bit about that in Legacy, right? So I'm thinking of the folks in the 90s, where, I was working at Indigenous agencies, and I was going to the healing circle and, the sweats and the pipe ceremonies offered through Anishinaabe Health. And I was able and blessed enough to be able to make an appointment with the medicine people who are coming down. And I would ask them questions like, don't know anything, got a question. And and so through that, they did sometimes tell me a little bit about themselves. You know yourself, every helping relationship is always reciprocal.
Yes.
Sometimes information is shared both ways. Not so much in the Western system, but I think in holistic and certainly culture-based systems. And so I remember one person, a medicine person, telling me that, you know, my and now I'm probably not going to get this completely right, but as my memory serves me, he told me that it was either his grandmother, maybe his auntie, a family member. They decided, because of who he was and the skills that they could already see as a young person that he would not be taken to residential school. They were going to hide him. And that's a common story. Other people have spoken about that. It has happened. And so he was, and then he did decades of apprenticeship under another medicine person. And then in his 40s, I guess, or 50s, he started seeing people on his own. And so, yes, in that community and those people, those families, that family, they held on to whatever they could furiously and with all the sacredness, if that's a word, sacredness, I guess it is, that they needed to use. They held on to that, and they said, no, we're gonna, and they did what they had to do. That person was then able to pass that along to all of the people. And I'm thinking of two different medicine people that I was able to see and ask questions about my health and about life, the universe, and everything. That they were able to save that. So I think many things have been saved. Yes, I do. Then there's also the part of me who has worked in community for 30 years now, since the early 90s. And I do see how much has been lost. But I don't like that term either. It was never lost. It was removed, right? So I see how much has been removed. And I know that I love my readers. So many people who have read Legacy have messaged me, emailed me and said, I see my family in this, thank you. Or thank you for saying the things that I say, but my family doesn't want to hear it. Or thank you for being so brave and saying certain things that like sometimes I'm afraid to say. And I'm like, oh, you're welcome. I'm used to getting in trouble. It's fine. And so I preface this next comment with that, just to say that over the 30 years, there's certain things I like to bring up to make sure that we're not thinking in a pan-Indigenous way. Yeah. Because I think that can be very destructive, and it does happen. And I'll just use one example, but guaranteed it's going to cause controversy. Sorry. Where it kind of bugs me sometimes when everybody uses the term Turtle Island for North America. Right. There are so many creation stories. Yeah. And yes, having lived in Tagaranto, Toronto for as many decades as I did, I understand the absolute sacredness of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe creation stories.
Yeah.
And there's other groups that may have, the sky woman falling to the earth in the back of the turtle story. But there's also so many of us who do not.
Right.
I've heard creation stories out here in the coast, it's raven and a clamshell.
Yeah.
Down south, I've had Pueblo people tell me their stories, not at all about a turtle, right? In Alberta, I heard a couple different ones. There was a little bit like the Sky Woman story in a way, but it was a raft with a wolf on it. I've heard a story that was about a giant beaver, which I think is so Canadian in
Yeah,
the
exactly.
Indigenous way. That is like, let's tell the giant beaver story.
Love it.
So I try to remind us all that we all have to be vigilant against pan-Indigenous stuff, pan-Indigenous thinking. I think we really have to be vigilant, and I pointed this out a lot in Legacy around, and I know I probably, made some people rather upset, but I think we need to talk about how our governance systems have been replaced by patriarchal systems where we used to at least have a balance in pre-colonial systems with the power of women and the power of men sitting in balance. Now, there's certain communities that have saved that today, and one of the examples I knew about from living in Toronto for so long was, of course, the Haudenosaunee Longhouse, where the clan mothers can dehorn the chiefs, right? So certain communities have definitely, and of course I can't speak for all communities, I can only speak for myself and some of the stories that I've heard and some of the things I understood growing up, some of the things I saw with my colleagues and maybe clients in my work. It's just me from my experience. I can only just speak for me, but what I've seen is that a lot has been saved, so much has been removed, and that we are definitely on a journey of reclamation. I mean, the story of the Seven Fires, it's I'm not going to ascribe it to a cultural group because I think it came from one place, and then I don't want to get that wrong, but I do say in Legacy that there's certain people that I've heard the story from, and they're of the one woman that wrote a book about it was Anishinaabe herself. When we think of that seventh generation in that prophecy, in that story, that we're the ones who are going to wake up and bring the people back to culture and to understanding and to all of this knowledge that we've been removed from and that has been removed from us. That was the seventh generation, was Gen X, baby. It was like the 90s, aughts, tens, and we've seen such a resurgence and such a change and such political activism and from the multiple resistances, but then that one resistance at Ganazatage in the 89, 90, and what is called Oka, the 90s, the aughts, the tens, it's been an amazing political and social process, and I was lucky enough to be part of a lot of it. I don't think anything is ever too late. I think and again, just speaking from myself, for myself, I think our ancestors come to us all the time from all sides. Being a mixie, it's not just my Indigenous ancestors who come to me. We all have that in our histories, and in our ways of knowing, our culture-based ways of knowing. And so I don't think it's ever too late. But I think we do have to be vigilant about making sure that we're not being too surfacey, that we're not being too pan, that we really consult with those who do have cultural and ceremonial knowledge, and those are usually the quietest, most unknown people at the community level. They're not the stars, they're not the indigerati, they're certainly not necessarily Well, no, I'll get in a whole heap of trouble if I say that. So let me just not say that. Um,
You're leaving
I
us
guess
all
what,
so curious.
yeah,
That's
I
okay.
know.
Yeah.
Well, let me say this. The European insistence on credentialism, I think, because there's all sorts of different places you can get credentials, right?
Hmm.
So I think that insistence on credentialism, which I have actively avoided, if you notice, I have an undergraduate degree and then I went back to get a postgraduate degree in education. But you know, I got accepted at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, OISE, and I got accepted at York University, both in Toronto. And I could have done the 2-year MEd at OISE, but I knew I didn't have enough money for 2 years and probably not enough energy when I was already
Yeah.
working and practicum teaching. And how do I do this? I knew I wouldn't survive 2 years. So I went to York and did the 1 year. And I only did it, and I thought, well, good. 1 year is better than 2 years anyway, because I was annoyed knowing that I was an adult educator and that I had all of these skills, that I still had to get that credential to be
Yeah.
able to teach in schools,
I
right?
know.
So there's this like Western insistence on credentialism, which when you have a lot of work experience, and that's what happens to a lot of Indigenous folks, especially
Yeah.
folks doing culture work or healing work. When I think of the medicine people or some of the ceremonialists that I've been able to share time with or learn some tiny things from, um, none of them are credentialed in anything,
Yeah.
right? So, mm, in terms of that issue, your question, it's never too late, but I think we have to be vigilant about certain things. Make sure we're talking to the right folks,
Yeah.
make sure we're rewarding and taking care of those folks,
Hmm.
making sure they have grocery money, that they have gas for the car, that they have childcare, that they have good housing, where they can do their work for communities, whether it's
Hmm.
planting a community garden, whether it's working with youth, whether it's starting the 60 Scoop Survivor Society, whatever
Yeah.
that is, whether it's teaching, ECE or something, early childhood education, whatever it is that they're doing. That we
Hmm.
need to make sure that those folks who are doing the work to bring culture-based ideas back into the community and to help people have the support that they need to do that work. So that's how I would answer. It's never too late.
Yeah.
I give thanks and props and many energetic blessings to this is a funny story. I'll end on this. There's a family from Saddle Lake, Alberta, that kind of took me under their wing in the early, mid, late '90s and taught me everything I know about being a Cree person, which is like this much, right? I have so much still to learn, but I really knew nothing before I met them, really nothing. Um, and at one point I was sitting at someone's kitchen table in Edmonton, and this lovely woman from Saddle Lake, someone phoned back in those days. Of course, we had no cell phones. So she like picked up a phone from a receiver on the table. Young people, there's this thing called telephone with dial pads. Yeah. And so obviously the person on the other line must have said to her, what are you doing? So she looked at me and she says, oh, and I couldn't hear what the other person was saying, but I heard what she said. And she said, oh, I'm just sitting here talking to this little lost Indian girl. She's looking at me straight up, right? Meeting eyes with me. And it wasn't a judgment.
No.
I kind of felt really seen in the worst and best ways.
Yes.
It's like, oh, I know nothing. But it wasn't a mean thing. It was so giving in a way. And she was connecting with me and just telling this person, oh, well, this is what I'm doing now. And there's a lineup outside my door. More people waiting, by the way. There was always someone at this woman's kitchen table, let me tell you. And so there's a lot of that. We share, we give, we create that space
Mm-hmm.
to relearn, to remember,
Mm-hmm.
to support each other on our spiritual journeys of what the heck did that dream mean? And
Yeah.
who is coming to me and what are they trying to tell me?
Yeah.
And we help each other on that. But I think we do have to be vigilant, yep, about, you know, what we put out there into the world. And that's the same for me when I write books. I have expert readers from within the community who tell me to get it together on page 24, sweetie, you
Yeah.
know, and then I have to rewrite it like, can't believe I missed that, you know.
Yeah.
And against all of those things, but knowing the richness that is still there and that it is waiting to be seen. And then our ancestors are supporting us, but also waiting for us
Mm-hmm.
to remember.
To
Yeah.
remember. Well, and it's, as again, you're telling and sharing these stories, and it's so many new pieces are coming out that I could have easily missed. One of these pieces, like the barriers that potentially, one of the barriers that potentially exist, and I can see how it really does exist, is the concept of credentialism too. Like, I don't think anybody would have said that, but of course, if all the credentials go to medical doctors to say that health, the only way to achieve health is through, pharmaceutical drugs and surgery, or go exercise, or it's a thrifty gene. Credentialism in itself is a barrier to people being healthy, because then we discount the traditional knowledge that is there.
Yeah.
So that in itself is a massive barrier. And I haven't read that anywhere. And so I'm seeing this, we do talk about, definitely in a lot of social science literature, the fact that we don't honor traditional knowledge, but I haven't seen it as credentialism being, it is a huge barrier. I see that now. And I see that in northern Saskatchewan, in La Roche. I have a friend there who was in my program, and she finished her dissertation, but she did talk about that a lot, how our governments, they send in experts
Yeah.
into Indigenous communities across Canada and say, go solve the problem.
Yep.
And then they just like get in, and then they're out because whatever they're bringing in is not working, but they have the credentials, so
Yeah.
they are the solution, but it has not done an ounce of good. And so this is huge barrier. And then there's another barrier too that really came out. So it's not just the forgetting or the lack of access to that traditional knowledge, but it's the taking care of the knowledge keepers, right? So if, and I hate to say solution, the problem, solution. And I'm like, what is the one thing that we could do that would heal everything? So again, I'm trying to get out of that. It is a problem that we all have, being in this Western world, that we want to just fix it. But if we were to fix something, it would be the taking care of the knowledge keepers, maybe first and foremost. Like you said, making sure they have food, making sure they have transportation, making sure that they're seen, making sure, and so that's also another place, like again, where I'm like, I would have come in throwing around the kale and the quinoa, but I'm like, whoa, Nikki, let's take another step back even further. So that is huge. So one piece that your book is called Legacy: Trauma, Story, and Indigenous Healing. I really want to touch on not just touch, I want to dive into the trauma piece, because you did talk about it. You talk about these micro hits of aggression and trauma, that are cumulative. So this cumulative stress disorder. But let's talk about the trauma and the depression, and because you do talk about that your whole book is about that. And how does that play a role in us being able to access, just all the other healing, whether it's the food, or the story, or the community, or the land.
Well, what I would say to start is that the cycle of intergenerational trauma, how one person's trauma can become generational, even though, the third or fifth generations didn't experience what, that ancestor exactly experienced. They may be experiencing contemporary forms of colonialism, but they didn't necessarily experience what that ancestor experienced. But when that cycle, just as I said with my own parents, their experiences, and then despite their best efforts and wanting a better lives for themselves and a life for their children and having all the dreams, how those are brought into the family system, right? And then from families, of course, then it ripples out into entire communities, right? So, I mean, I think there's a way that what did it for me is understanding some of the things that you pointed out: depression, higher incidence of addictions, some of the, and we've been, talking already about, some of the physical health, the aspects of trauma that, are seen, whether it's diabetes or just even increased rates of mortality from accidents, those sorts of things. What did it for me was understanding when I first saw the Aboriginal Healing Foundation's list of intergenerational impacts, reading that list. On the one hand, it was kind of a gut punch because it was like, holy way to round up every bad thing about us and put it on, 1.5 sides of an 8.5 by 11 page. AHF, thank you. It kind of felt like, ooh, that's a lot of bad stuff there. And as someone who is, back in the 90s, written a lot of letters to the CBC, love you, CBC, but it's a reciprocal relationship. We have to be in dialogue around media stereotypes and stuff. I never want to see us only speak about that list, because then it begins to be pathologizing. Then those things that are the symptoms of colonization and the ill spiritual, mental, and physical health that creates begin to be seen as inherent to Indigenous cultures. So that was the thing for me with Legacy. And that's why it took 3 drafts and a lot of expert readers, and some very good editors at my press, my publishers, to make sure that we had a book that was equal parts. Yes, these things are happening, and we cannot and should not talk about them. We have to talk about them. Now, if a reader is not ready to talk about them, they might have to put the book aside or put it down. And I've had many readers tell me this. Man, that was a tough read. Is it weird to say I enjoyed it? And then I always laugh because I want you to enjoy the journey and to think about the possibilities in your own life of healing. And that's where we come from, the enjoyment to the joy, right? But yeah, it's a tough slog sometimes, because when you read the terrible things that have happened under or as a result of colonization, and then how that gets passed down intergenerationally, you see that big list. And then it's like, oh my heavens. But that's where we have to be careful, and how I tried to be very careful in Legacy around always stating and restating all the time that this is not inherent to our cultures.
No.
This is not inherent to it, just over and over and over. With every kind of situation, context, the chapter theme, whatever I was discussing, even though I know I said it 2 chapters ahead, I'm going to say it again. This is not inherent to our cultures in pre-colonial times. This did not exist. We know this because, pointing to some research, for instance, about, the health of children when they registered for residential school and when they left, right? So, and trying to, or, cultural beliefs or things that I've learned from the people who have been kind enough to share them with me. So I think we need to understand that there's a story that we all carry. And
Mhm.
that story for most, and I'm going to say BIPOC in the wide sense, for all the marginalized people who have been marginalized by colonialism worldwide, European colonialism, by now capitalism. I mean, and we see this
Mhm.
with the floods in Pakistan. As I said, it's the major, and I think this is correct. Fact
Mhm.
check me if you must, but those top 100 corporations creating 70% of climate change. Now we've got these floods. Pakistan, the small freehold farmers are now being pushed over the last few decades to go into like monocultures and to use GMO seeds, and the corporation owns all that, and yada yada, the amount of debt that's created, all of these things that we see. So I'm going to widen it to BIPOC, all of us
Mhm.
under colonization and capitalism. We have to see that big list of uglies, as I
Mhm.
call them.
Yeah.
Not that people are ever ugly, but behaviors can be ugly for
Yeah.
ourselves. They can be self-harming, and then they can put harm out into the community and into the family as well. We need to look at the list of uglies and understand that they come from somewhere, and then
Yeah.
understand that we internalize those stories. Because growing up in Peace River, which in Cree is known as Sagatawa, I have terrible Cree pronunciation, but that's my attempt.
At least you're trying.
Yeah,
That's
I'm
what's
trying. I'm
important.
trying. Yes, I'm trying. Um, we have to understand that. I mean, well, for me, when I was growing up, I just heard, and it was common conversation, and comments would be made, sometimes about me directly in front of me, as if I
Mhm.
weren't there, around, again, how inferior we were, or how this, or
Mhm.
how. So we internalize stories about ourselves. We
Yeah.
certainly internalize stories about others. Um, and then, of course, societies begin to believe stories about, especially others, but even
Yeah.
about just society and people in your own community, however diverse that may be. And so I think there's that part there of understanding that stopping the cycle of intergenerational trauma, getting rid of the barriers to health, and creating better health through harmony is
Mhm.
about looking at all the ways that we victimize each other too.
Mhm.
And that's a hard one, because a lot of people would argue with me and say that pulls focus away from colonialism.
Yeah.
It's their fault. Don't put it on us. What did you just say about climate change? Why are you downloading it to us?
Yeah.
But it's a little bit different, because with intergenerational trauma, that's what we call an intergenerational.
Mhm.
With the removal of all of that knowledge, and with the removal from the lands and all of the other stuff we talked about today, the cycle is strengthened. And of course, that's what the colonial government wants. They
Yeah.
want, it was a deliberate government policy through residential schools, through different other things, to fracture the Indigenous family, to move us off the land.
Mhm.
That's a colonial tactic, and it's happened everywhere. I just
Yeah.
mentioned Pakistan and moving the farmers. Look
Yep.
at communist China, but it's now communist capitalist China,
Yeah.
moving people from villages so they can flood it with the major dams, so they can send them to factories to provide, goods for the export market. Like, it's capitalism is ridiculous,
It
and
is.
it's ridiculously harming.
Yeah.
Well, market capitalism. There are different kinds of capitalism, like a food co-op, or like, more. There are more holistic ways of thinking about, you know, that form of exchange. But so when I think of intergenerational trauma and then healing, I think we have to be really aware of the commonalities that we share as BIPOC peoples. Um, and looking at how we've internalized that, how that's made us think about other peoples, both within our own communities and other
Mhm.
non-European communities, and then how we are now assisting the colonial agenda of pushing our children to get a real job like an engineer or a
Yeah.
doctor. Wait a minute, what?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, yay, but also, how can we bring our own knowledge into those systems and institutions? Instead of saying, go be like them,
Yeah.
how can we balance that, right? So, and how that trauma then, not just within our families and communities, but how then when we sort of, I don't know the word I need. It's not that we're imitating, but when we start believing that we have to change, or that those removals were good, that somehow
Yeah.
that knowledge is backward or uncivilized or old. And so we're going to believe these new things, which are overwhelmingly a result of European Enlightenment thinking. So, okay, we're going to go and do that. But it's not only harming our families and communities, it's also harming the natural world.
Yes.
And so, what is our responsibility as BIPOC peoples, right? And I struggle with BIPOC peoples as a term because people of color is in there. So
Yeah.
people of color peoples. Anyway,
Yeah, I
BIPOC
know.
peoples.
I always struggle with that too. I always have to double check in my brain
Yeah.
as I say it.
BIPOCs? Should we just pluralize it by pox?
Yeah,
BIPOCs. But then that sounds like a pox. A pox upon your houses.
Oh, yeah.
We've already done that. Okay.
We've already done that, been there. Don't want to go back
Lord.
to that.
Yeah. So I don't know if I quite answered the question, but I think that's where I'm at right now with my thinking, which is what is going into a lot of my work. So I think that's where I'm at. Is not that of course we point. I started out talking about colonial control. Of course we identify those factors, those external factors. But if I look at Indigenous cultural approaches, the medicine wheel is only one of many. Not everybody uses it. It's a Plains thing. So as a Nehio, as a Cree person, I think of the medicine wheel, and I think, well, some of my teachings around it. There's so many different teachings and ways it can be used, but there's this understanding through my teachings that what I've heard from other people, that there's the internal world and then there's the external world. So we do have to think about intergenerational trauma, yes, families and communities, but then again, the external forces upon us and how we internally are also perpetuating that, and also projecting it back out, as I said, onto others, the natural world, into our systems and institutions. And it's all about, what stories do we believe about ourselves, about what we know, about what has happened to us, where we should be going, what we should be doing. Is there not a way that we can do? And this term has gained some use over the last few years, that two-eyed seeing. Can we not bring both into our work in the systems and institutions? Why does it have to be the European Enlightenment stuff? So yeah, that's where I'm at right now. I don't know if I really answered.
You are perfect. You're doing everything you're supposed to be doing in this interview, and which you are bringing new knowledge forward by sharing your stories, and whether it's new knowledge, but I don't want to say new knowledge, but so I'll start with this. What you're doing is allowing us to see. And it's interesting that we started off our interview talking about your eyesight and the challenges that you were having in your one eye, and talking about, like, what is it that we want to see and not see, and how that relates to the physical manifestation in the body. But one of the big things that I had to highlight it in my notes here is when you said seeing that these things are not inherent to our culture, not inherent to our land, and I added not inherent to our earth. And it's this ability to see people, not as, like, if we look at somebody who is overweight and has diabetes and, is depressed and doesn't, isn't treating their children well, like we're seeing their behaviors that we don't like, or if we're seeing somebody who's slim and they appear healthy and they're, taking medications or not like, what is it that we're truly seeing? And to see as well, like, I loved how you talked about the medicine wheel and looking internally and externally. So when we see that, but we also see our histories. And when I ask the question, what are the barriers that prevent us from, being able to access these foods and have these, access to land that, eventually gives us the food that we can use to heal ourselves. but I see one of the barriers is not seeing, but one of the opportunities is seeing. We
Yeah.
see the trauma. And when we see the trauma, again, it doesn't mean like with the thrifty gene, like, oh, we think it's just the gene now. Well, here, we just think it's the trauma. So we have to just treat the trauma. But it's to see it, which leaves me with, for now, unfortunately, only because I have 10 minutes before I'm being interviewed. But I wanted to ask you, so the opposite of my question, or what are the opportunities?
Mm. Well,
Not the
I think
solutions, but the
the
opportunities.
opportunities. Well, I mean, I don't want to feel like I'm copying you because you did just say seeing people. But thank you for raising the subtitle of the book, Legacy, Trauma, Story, and Indigenous Healing. The story part is about seeing. I
Mm,
think we all have um, our stories, and some of
mhm.
them are the same. And that's why I get such lovely emails and messages and things on social media from readers who say, that's like my family, or I finally understand my mother, or whatever it was. Um, we see each other when we share our stories, and that
Mm,
builds connection, and that builds collaboration, and
mm,
it builds strength in marginalized communities because now we're working together
yeah.
against some of the external forces that would seek to control us. Um, but I think too that it helps us be trauma informed and
Mhm.
client centered when we talk about seeing. Because if we think we know someone's story from a file or from a diagnosis, a label,
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
course we don't, right? That was my attempt to make a noise on the Jeopardy when
Uh,
with the wrong answer. Yeah. I don't know if it came out that way, but anyway,
it did.
the
It
wrong
did.
answer. Okay. Yeah, wrong answer. Um, I was a classroom teacher and I'm still an educator. I was an educator before I went into the classroom, as I said previously, but when I was in the classroom, there's a big thing at the beginning of the year where a lot of teachers would read the student records of a student that had come with them
Mhm.
from previous years, previous schools, they're all kept in the office and you can access any student's student record, previous grades, labels, diagnoses,
Yeah.
problems, issues, letters in the file, anything like that. Um, Sometimes there would be a good thing, but most often it was just bad stuff, the ugly stuff, right? And I made it a focus of my teaching practice when I was in the public school system. And I still do work with public school boards and that sort of thing. But when I was actually in a classroom situation in the public school system, I made it a central part of my practice to never go look at those student records until
Mhm.
like, oh, maybe 3, 4 months in. Because then it could be helpful. Because
Yeah.
then you can see that, oh, someone else said this about this kid. Well, I've seen this and I've been with this kid for 3 months now and I've never seen that. So okay, I'll ignore that. Or you'd see something, you go, oh, well, something about what had happened to them. And I would, kind of think, oh, that explains a lot now. I've been trying to figure out why this kid
Yeah.
does this when I do this. Oh, okay.
Mm.
Okay, now I understand it. But I would never read it right away, those student records, because it's like if you seek to understand someone's story from labels and diagnoses and incident reports and all that stuff placed in a file, and as I said, it's usually the deficit thinking stuff, the problems with this child, what this child needs, and not in a holistic way, but what they need like to correct their behavior, then
Yeah.
you're gonna have a preconceived story about that child. So to be trauma informed and client centered in our work, whether it's healthcare based or any other helping profession, or just as people in the world understanding members of our family or the neighbor next door, I think we have to just interact with people and
Mhm.
hear their stories from them and see how their stories play out. in the comments they make about themselves, the comments they make about mom and dad or my cousin or my sister or whomever, and to see how they interact with you and to see their skills as well as their challenges and to talk to them about their goals. And when did you feel successful when we did this workshop if it's an adult, or this lesson if it's a kid? And then, have that conversation about, okay, you were so successful then. I'm glad you felt it. When did you feel like you were kind of lost and needed help? And so to get this narrative from the kid of, oh, and they always know it. Oh, I really felt like I needed help here.
Yeah.
So instead of going in as the expert and diagnosing top down, create a relationship, talk to that person. And then you have a story of that person. So then whatever else you hear, which can be helpful, labels, diagnoses, reports, whatever it is, that is not your full and complete and sort of assumed story going in.
Yeah.
You're actually going on your relationship with that person and your knowledge of that person. And then anything else becomes an addition to that you can ignore or use. And then you really know that person. So I think story and seeing is just key to everything. Everyone has a story, and there are always similarities. You can say, oh yeah, that happened in my family. But also every person's story is so incredibly different and shaded and slightly just their own. And unless we know a person's story, we don't know them. And in order to do the work we do and to seek, the understandings about what's going on and how I'm going to say, what you said before around, well, I don't want to say problem solution. So I'm going to use the term fix it, but not in a bad way, not in a top-down way. If we want to fix things, if we want to change things, there you go. We want to transform things. That's a better word.
Transform.
We need to share stories. We need to collaborate. We need to discuss. We need to do things like this,
Well, this has been huge. Yeah, this has been huge for me and just the work that I do, that just this conversation today, I can see all the areas where my business is going to be informed and transformed. Because it just, you can't help it. You can't help but go, oh, right. There is a healthier, more holistic, more sustainable, more connected way of doing things. And it's by story. It's why I chose narrative inquiry. It's why I chose you. It's why the universe chose you and brought your book to me and made all of this happen. But I think that is a beautiful way of wrapping up this interview. It just landed so beautifully. And I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your stories. I think this is just the beginning for us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so too. We have lots more conversations to have, I think. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that too. So thank you so much for your time. And I'm going to be in touch with you. First of all, we should also say, how can people be in touch with you? What are the places that people should go to be able to access more of you and everything you bring to this world?
Oh, well, thank you for that. I don't know exactly what I've brought, if not to be, too humble or anything, but sometimes I look and I go, did I do all that? Or is that anything really? So it's good to be humble.
It's good to be humble, but you have brought, but I'll say it, you've brought a lot of just invaluable seeing to the world.
Well, thank you. I mean, I accept that humbly because I feel like there's so much more that I need to learn and do. But for what I've done so far, as I say, 54, I'm young, man. I got so much more to learn and do and contribute. But, there's still a lot of people on LinkedIn. People make fun of LinkedIn, but I keep my LinkedIn profile updated because people check it. I get messages.
They do. People are active there.
Yeah.
Okay,
it's kind of nerdy, but in the best way.
It is.
So if you want to know like credentials and some, I can't put 30 years on there, but some of the recent places that I've worked, especially education experience and agency work experience, do check out my LinkedIn profile,
Great.
which is just my name, of course, Suzanne Methot. But everything's linked on my website. So SuzanneMethot.ca, and the last name is Methot. Yes, I'm pronouncing it in English. That's a whole story we don't have time for now. But so, and there are links to LinkedIn. I do have a few videos on my YouTube channel. I'll be adding lots more this winter. I have a new book coming out next June. It's a YA, a young adult adaptation of legacy. So I'm adding videos and gearing up for that and the work that we want to do around that book. So, but there are a few on there already of events that I've done and talks that I've been invited to give. So all of the little, what do you call them? The little tabs, I guess, the little clicky things are on my website.
Amazing.
So yeah, the website, LinkedIn, YouTube, and I do have a Facebook page as well. So I'm out there, and whatever people, I welcome, people's thoughts and the conversations that we get to have in that space. So.
Amazing. We'll share all those links down below in the show notes. Okay, amazing, Suzanne. Thank you so much. I wish I could hug you through the screen, but I'll say that. And I'm going to click off now and go to my next interview. But if you want to do another podcast on our show, please, I'm going to give you a link that you can book it at any time. If you're like, let's dive into this other topic, even or anything.
And you're going into your interview, but we'll be in touch later about any other things.
Yeah, and the TED Talk as well. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Amazing. Okay,
go.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.